It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. I stumbled on this article this week. Not this week, it was like last week. And it's called, rightly titled, The Bizarre Story Behind the FBI's Fake Documentary About the Bundy Family. And I'm reading this article. Excellent work. It's on the Intercept, intercept.com. Check this out. And I'm reading this thing. It's a fascinating story about how the FBI goes undercover and it's saying they're going to do a documentary. And they're filming all the characters around that Bundy standoff and the Hammond Ranch, the Oregon standoff. Who's the author? Trevor Aaronson, a friend of the show. He's been on before. We had him on for a good 2 hours a while back. He's the author of the book, The Terror Factory, Inside the FBI's Manufactured War on Terrorism. So go back in the archives and check out our first interview with Trevor Aaronson. And also, too, you know what? I'm gonna do a playlist on YouTube, too, at Bundy Ranch, all the shows we've done about Bundy Ranch. But today we have Trevor Aaronson. Trevor, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thank you so much. I forgot to mention, too, he's got a website, TrevorAaronson.com. Okay, brother. Like we were just saying off the air, I love this article, man. It's what a story, you know?
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Great stuff, man. Great work, too. But before we get started, tell us about yourself. Who's Trevor Aaronson?
Sure. So I'm a journalist. I for the last, I guess going on 7-8 years now, I've focused on the intersection of national security and civil liberties, and my work of late has been for the Intercept. You know, I'm mainly focused on the FBI's counterterrorism practices and programs, and looking at some of the abuses that have occurred in that neighborhood. A few years ago, I wrote a book, as you mentioned. It was the purpose of my last visit on your show, called The Terror Factory, and what that was about was the FBI's transformation post 9/11 from an organization that investigates crimes after the fact to the organization is today, which is very much an intelligence and counterterrorism agency. And the book took a specific focus at the FBI's use of informants. The fact that after 9/11, the FBI amassed, more than 15,000 informants in its ranks, and that it's used many of those informants in sting operations where they'll, troll Muslim communities looking for, in the FBI's view, people who could be terrorists, but in reality, they often find people who are, easily manipulated or, kind of more, more words than action. But for an FBI agent or an informant, are really incapable of any significant violence. But the FBI, through these sting operations, provides these people with everything that they need and moves them forward in plots and then prosecutes them to the fullest extent of the law. And, if you look closely at the record of terrorism prosecutions, post 9/11, there are a few cases that involve really dangerous guys and, real terrorists in the United States. But, the vast majority tend to be these kind of mentally ill or easily vulnerable or manipulated guys that get lured into sting operations. And so that's been the focus of my work the last few years. But, as this story about the Bundy investigation shows, I'm really kind of more interested in the FBI's work broadly and, questions about, the ethics and morality and the way it investigates, some of its cases.
Yeah, which is a great topic. There's something very important that we need to keep our eyes. We need to be vigilant on this kind of thing because just like you said, they get these incompetents who can't put together a plot themselves, or even probably wouldn't even want to. And you insert this one guy who's working for the FBI. He's getting funded by the FBI, and he got the savvy and the wherewithal to hook up a connection like that. And he gets them all rounded up together, and then they're all in a jackpot, and he walks away and works in the next group. Fascinating stuff that we even allow this to go on in our country, but it's just, I guess that's the way things are in 2017.
Yeah, no, there are some very, very egregious examples. The one that comes to my mind as far as sting operations involving terrorism of recent cases was this guy in upstate New York named Emmanuel Lutchman, who was known around town as the crazy guy who would scream on the street corner. He was homeless. He had no money. He told an FBI informant that he was in contact with someone from ISIS. Who knows if that's true? It seems hard to believe given that he was a homeless man. But he said that they set up this sting operation on him where he claimed that he wanted to attack a New Year's Eve, festival. And problem was, of course, they didn't have any weapons. He didn't have any money. And so to move the plot forward, the FBI informant gave him $40 so he could go to the local Walmart and purchase a machete and knives that he ultimately was, charged with trying to use for the attack, right? Like, he never got to the attack. He never attacked anyone. But, buying those weapons with the FBI's money was enough to prove the conspiracy that he wanted to commit this act of terrorism. And ultimately, he was charged and convicted. And that's an example of the type of case that they pursue, where kind of any reasonable person looking at the evidence would say, yeah, there's no way that this guy is in the same league as the real terrorists that we think of.
Yeah, but they got the headline. They got the headline. We caught one.
Yeah.
Oh man.
There's a certain like wag the dog aspect to this, of course, right? That the FBI gets $3 billion every year for its counterterrorism and counterintelligence budget, and it can't just say like, hey, we looked around and we found one guy, or we didn't find anybody. The sting operations provide them with a very convenient and in good way to go to the public and go to Congress and say, hey, look at us, we're keeping America safe.
Yeah. So check out The Terror Factory, Inside the FBI's Manufactured War on Terrorism. The book will be, it's probably already in the Opera and Report bookstore, but I'll put it back up on the blog with a link to this show here. So now, how'd you get, what happened with the Bundy thing? You stumbled first on the undercover FBI agent who got arrested in Colorado?
That actually came after we realized we had when we had the material. So the story of the quick kind of story, and I know I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with the Bundy family and the standoff, but basically the BLM and the federal government came down on Cliven Bundy for unpaid grazing fees that amounted to more than $1 million by 2014, and BLM using a trespassing warrant that was issued by a federal judge started rounding up the cattle, and this story kind of really blew up on social media, and a lot of people from right-wing militias to just everyday citizens really saw this as a government overreach and abuse of power, and came to Cliven's aid and protested against the government. Well, this resulted in basically an armed standoff between citizens supporting Cliven Bundy and Bureau of Land Management agents who were protecting the contract cowboys who were rounding up the cattle. And the federal government, fearing a kind of another Ruby Ridge, just decided to let the cattle go and retreat. And at that point, from what we know from court records and some testimony so far, the FBI then stepped in and said, okay, we're going to investigate how Cliven Bundy organized these armed men, and in doing so, what crimes were committed. And so what the FBI decided to do in order to basically investigate something that had long already occurred, they decided to create a fake documentary company called Longbow Productions, based in Nashville, Tennessee, and they really spared no expense. They bought expensive camera equipment, lighting, everything that a professional documentary crew would have. They had an office set up in Nashville, and they had a crew at various times of as many as 6 people, and filmed for nearly a year. And so what they ultimately produced was the raw material that really any documentary crew would produce. It was interviews with the primary suspects. It was, B-roll. It was also undercover audio. And this was turned over to the U.S. District Court in Las Vegas as evidence under seal in the trial against Cliven and his sons, and about a dozen supporters who were also indicted. And so we were able to obtain this footage, which is still under seal, and kind of tell the story of this undercover documentary crew, and how they went about investigating the Bundys.
Let me ask you this now, because the whole Bundy thing just kind of blew up out of nowhere, because this thing, his story up there with not wanting to pay his grazing and battling with BLM, that was going on for a long, long time. But it was the Pete Santilli video. And Pete Santilli, if you look into this guy, a lot of people think he's FBI. There was a whole big scandal where supposedly Anonymous hacked into his fax machine account, and they had some faxes going back and forth between him and the FBI, asking for he was complaining to the FBI that he wasn't being treated well. Did you come up with anything on that angle?
So I obviously know about Pete Santilli. I never was able to substantiate any of the rumors that he was working with the FBI. But, I mean, there is a direct connection between Pete Santilli and the publicity and ultimately the number of protesters that came to support Cliven Bundy. I mean, Santilli's internet radio show was kind of among the first to publicize Cliven's efforts, and then he also had a video that ended up going viral, where at one point there were rumors going around that the BLM was mistreating Bundy's cattle, even killing the cattle, and the Bundy supporters set up a roadblock basically to stop the contract cowboys because they wanted to inspect the cattle to make sure that they were being treated well. And at one point, Cliven Bundy's sister, who had survived cancer and was not exactly the most threatening person, was thrown to the ground by BLM agents. And I believe it was Ammon. Ammon was attacked by one of the dogs, and then he kicked the dog, and then BLM agents tased him. And Santilli got all of this on video and put it on social media, and it was widely shared, and it became kind of a, for lack of a better description, kind of a rallying cry on social media for the abuses of power, or the perceived abuses of power, that the federal government was involved in. And and then Santilli continued all the way through kind of the ultimate Malheur occupation as kind of an orbiting figure in the Bundy world. But whether he was an informant, I mean, I don't know about that. But I mean, he definitely was a provocateur of some sort, at the very least kind of a media provocateur by following them and, publicizing their kind of stand against the government.
And ultimately, he was arrested too.
He was arrested too. I believe, I'd have to double check this. I believe the charges against him in Oregon in the Malheur case were dropped, and but I think he still has a pending case in Nevada, if I remember correctly. There are so many defendants, it's hard to keep track of who's got an active case and who doesn't at this point.
Yeah. And in Nevada, I think the next hearing or something like that, or the trial starts like in July or June, something 26, something like that.
Yeah. So originally, so there were 6 defendants who recently were tried, and that trial did not involve Cliven and his sons. It involved involved a guy named Greg Burleson, who actually also, or we can confirm, was a former FBI informant, and several other people who had supported the Bundys. And in that trial, 2 people were convicted, including Burleson, and 4 ended in a hung jury. And so originally, Cliven and his sons and a few others were scheduled for trial starting June 26th, but it was just announced late last week that the judge decided to retry the 4 who were hung on June 26th. So they're pushing Cliven and his sons back even further. And their lawyers have argued that this is a violation of speedy trial, and that Cliven and his sons have been waiting far too long to face trial. But the judge has so far been unconvinced by that argument. So
Greg Burleson was also an FBI informant, and how then when you look at this case, because especially with your perspective and your knowledge of this kind of area, does this fit into that? You know what I mean? Does this fit into the stereotype of what you find with these FBI operations?
So the one thing that's worth noting, and we note this in our story about Greg Burleson, is that when the ultimate documentary or fake documentary starts, Burleson is by then not on the FBI books. He's no longer an informant. But of the people that they interviewed, including Burleson, Burleson was the one who was the most kind of aggressive in his language about wanting to do harm to federal agents. I mean, he says verbatim that, the reason that he went to Cliven Bundy's ranch was that, he wanted to put BLM agents 6 feet under, that he wanted to, go up against federal agents and attack them. And, the other people that they interviewed, were not saying things like that. Eric Parker, for example, who is the man in the famous or like iconic video of the Bundy standoff where he's at the overpass with a rifle in hand looking down on federal agents. He says in his interview, like, look, we didn't want violence. Nobody wanted to die that day. But in Burleson's case, what we know is that he lived in Arizona, and prior to coming up to support the Bundys, he had been involved with some right-wing groups that did border patrol officials. There was also a neo-Nazi guy named J.T. Reddy who had been involved in some crimes, and Burleson was providing information to the FBI during that period of time. At some point, Burleson was transferred. His handler in Arizona transferred him to an agent in Las Vegas as an informant prior to his coming up to support the Bundys. And that agent had closed him down. And it's not clear why. The FBI has not been upfront about why it closed down Burleson. And it's also unclear whether the undercover FBI agents who were acting as documentarians even knew that Burleson was a former FBI informant. But I mean, what is interesting about his story is that it's indicative often of the story of FBI informants, which is that they tend to be among the criminals, right? Like, you know, in this case, they're investigating all these guys for possibilities that they wanted to commit violence against federal agents. And it turns out, you know, lo and behold, the guy who seems most willing to want to do something like that is the former FBI informant. And so that's kind of indicative of the FBI in that sense, where, you know, they're often employing some pretty terrible people. To the FBI's credit, what they'll say is, well, look, choir boys can't catch the devil. It takes a devil to catch a devil, and that they often have to employ people of pretty odious character to find the others who are of odious character as well.
Well, they did a good job then with Burleson, because he came out of that J.T. Reddy group, and Reddy killed his girlfriend and her kids in a suicide household domestic thing where he killed his whole family that he was living with. You can't get much worse than that, in my opinion. So, and Burleson was the guy too. Now, is he the one? Am I correct that he inserted himself into the Bundy family and he was their gatekeeper? He called himself.
No, that was a guy who went by the name Buddha, or Brian Cavalier, and Brian Cavalier was also from Arizona, if my memory serves. Was a rather unusual guy, where he would describe having been a U.S. Special Forces Marine and having worked for Blackwater. It looks like it's actually kind of a case of stolen valor. Like, we could not find any example of Brian Cavalier having served in the U.S. Marine Corps. We tried to verify that from the U.S. Marine Corps. They have no record of him and his date of birth. But this was a guy who basically claimed that he was this badass Marine and had killed people in the sandbox, and then basically is coming there to protect the Bundys, and he basically inserts himself as something of the bodyguard for the Bundy family and the gatekeeper. And so what we see in the evidence that the fake documentary crew produced is that Buddha, or Brian Cavalier, is the guy that they're constantly going through and calling to set up interviews with Cliven Bundy and Ammon Bundy and Ryan Bundy. And there is this interesting story about kind of the culture that was created around the Bundys, right? Like, there was this kind of group that was created who followed Cliven, and in Buddha's case very specifically, were trying to protect Cliven. And I think the government, from the outside looking in and seeing that, had assumed that Cliven Bundy was this guy who was the mastermind, was organizing all of these right-wing elements and these militiamen and these armed people who were taking a stand against the U.S. government, when in fact I think the evidence really suggests that it was far more organic. I mean, I think even Cliven Bundy and the government really underestimated the power that social media had in distributing information about what was happening on the Nevada ranch and inspiring people to come out and support him in that way. Cliven, in his interview with the fake documentary crew, basically says, like, look, I did not ask these people to come here, but if you're asking me if these guys did me a solid, if they did me a favor, yeah, I'm really grateful for what they did. And I think one of the in the government's investigation of the case, I think one of their early mistakes of thinking was that Cliven Bundy was this master organizer, when in fact I think this was very much kind of an organic thing that also was propelled a little bit by an early example of like fake news, right? Like, when we talk about fake news and now it's in the context of claims that Russia meddled in the election and distributed anti-Hillary messages, but there was a certain amount of that existed with Cliven's case, right? Like, there was a lot of fake news about like how the BLM was mistreating the cattle and even killing the cattle. And these types of stories were circulating in social media, kind of further inspiring people to, to go and support Cliven. And so, the way the protests were organized and the way that so many people came with arms, with guns to support him, that was all very organic. And I think the government really underestimated that when it went to investigate Bundy as the mastermind of this kind of larger conspiracy in the government's view.
I had forgotten. You're so right about that, about the fake news that was going on. Because I live here, and I know in fact, the week before that the raid, I guess you'd call it, or the occupation by the BLM, my daughter was up there in Mesquite, which is right by Bundy Ranch, playing basketball. And as we were driving up there was a bunch of BLM cars, like, driver to driver, parked side by side, talking to each other. There's about 6 of those cars up there. And I says, well, why would they be up here? This is so weird. But there was so much weird news stories, like this stuff about China. They sold mineral rights to China, and Harry Reid was doing land deals. And even Pete Santilli, I remember listening to some of his broadcasts where he's talking about he's thinking that he's near Lake Mead. He's up there in Mesquite. He doesn't even know where he is, and because there had been a bicyclist that was shot by the BLM on Lake at Red Rock, and he thought he was near Red Rock. It was just so bizarre coming from a local. Like everyone thought it was like everything was like right next door to each other. It was like hours away from each other. Just. And you can't do this story, too. I read your article. You can't write this article without the word bizarre in the title. You know what I mean? It's just...
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I remember, one of the comments to our story actually mentioned, criticized us and said, like, hey, you didn't talk about how Harry Reid was going to, benefit financially by, confiscating the Bundy land. And, there was this element of fake news that just circulated very broadly. And it definitely had its effect here. I think this is kind of the new media ecosystem that we're now living in, where we're always going to face things like this. But in some ways, the what we're seeing on the presidential campaign, the questions there, those existed within the Bundy claims or the Bundy story. And also, this was a cause that was taken up by, the InfoWars of the right-wing media. And so, the organizations that were championing this issue are also the same ones that would peddle in conspiracy theories. And so, it just created an environment where, a lot of fake news was distributed, and it made it seem like the government was overstepping its power perhaps a lot more than it really was. That said, the government did some really stupid things, right? Like, in trying to corral the protesters, it was a really dumb idea to create First Amendment areas, right? I don't think the government intended to, silence people. They were looking at public safety, but like things like that, then I think further inflamed a lot of the conspiracy theories that were at play already.
Yeah, the free speech zones, that's just what you need to mention to a bunch of constitutionalists, who are